join me in welcoming Alex Otieno.
Thank you very much, delegates. I understand you've done a lot of work already. So I feel fortunate to get you at this point when you're all informed and keyed up and ready to solve some of the problems you're dealing with. The topic I'm going to be dealing with today is child labor. And my approach is going to be that I'll have some information for you as we go along. I expect that you should interrupt me as necessary to ask questions if you want to clarify something or if you want to add on to what I said. And then we'll also have a question and answer session along with it. So that's how we're going to proceed. The topic is of fundamental interest to the global community, to us as a globality, if you like, because all countries and all governments have children. And while we strive for international peace and security as one of the main roles of the United Nations, we know that well-being, human dignity, and human rights are fundamental to having international peace and security. As a pillar of that, we know that children's rights and children's well-being is a crucial part of making healthy societies that are sustainable. So I want you to work with me in thinking through how we can address this problem that is still a persistent problem in most of the world. What's the history of the problem? We can trace it back to the 18th century. In some sense, one could say that children always kind of worked in hunter-gatherer communities and in all sorts of arrangements. But more precisely, in the 18th century, with the onset of industrialization, it became easier for some of the people who owned the factories to use child labor because it was cheaper and children could do the same kind of work that adults did in a lot of cases. So that kind of set the stage for what I regard as sort of exploitation and abuse of children by using them for labor and thereby denying them the possibility of working to further themselves, to learn skills, to gain knowledge, to become sophisticated in the ways of their community and the ways of the world, because they'll be preoccupied with laboring. And it becomes particularly crucial if you think about a child who works, say, from age 7 or 8 through they becoming an adult to when they transition to becoming an adult, the likelihood of getting higher paid work is much lower. So the possibilities and opportunities are limited. And over time, one of the things we know is that we sort of struggled as a global community, as a part of the United Nations, to define what child labor is. Generally speaking, the definition of child labor is that it's any work that is performed by a child. And the challenging thing is that if the work is performed by a child, it can be harmful to a child and can impede their well-being. So that's kind of why it's an important thing. Additionally, it is linked to poverty, lack of education, and human rights violations. So we can actually make a link between poor households, or poor communities, poor countries, and the likelihood of their family members, especially their children, engaging in child labor. And additionally, if we look at the map of child labor or the configuration of child labor globally, we'll find that a lot of children who are engaged in work at an early age are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. In some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, up to one in every 4 children is engaged, almost 25% is engaged in child labor. When you aggregate the numbers, it's slightly lower. It's about 41%. Now, it's important to say or to mention that we've made progress in addressing child labor. That if we go back to the year 2000 and trace the report that was done by the International Labour Organization looking at the data from 2000 to 2012, there's been substantial reduction. And so there used to be 246 million children who were in child labor, and now it's down to 168 million children in child labor. That's a significant reduction. Nonetheless, we're still talking about 168 million children. So our focus should be not necessarily on the progress. The progress is important because it suggests to us that we can do something as a collectivity in the future, but it also suggests that we have more to do. So something can be done, the improvements can be made, but there are challenges that still face us. And the reduction, the other thing to remember is that up to 85 million children of the 168 who are still working are still engaged in hazardous work that can have negative consequences on their health, their physical well-being, as well as their emotional well-being. I regard child labor to be a wicked, persistent problem, a persistent, wicked problem, because child labor is one of the most troubling challenges facing us. If you look at its characteristics and its scope, like the number of kids who are affected, how it affects boys and girls, the sectors that it affects, agriculture, we'll talk about that shortly, mining in some areas, service industry in some places, that it's really something that needs to be addressed. And the International Labour Organization, 2 years ago, produced a report, International Program for the Elimination of Child Labor. I found that the problem is persistent and always has negative outcomes. Negative outcomes in terms of lower levels of education, lower health outcomes, and so consequently, if we think about development as a human development focused on the human being as opposed to the gross domestic product of a country, then it's really inexcusable because it has negative consequences on children. So more needs to be done. The ILO, International Labour Organization, and based on the meetings from 2013 in Brazil, noted that while there have been improvements since 2000, those improvements are insufficient for us to reach the goals that are timed for next year. Goals in terms of reducing father-child labor and working towards its eventual elimination. So, great, there's been forward movement. Your individual countries and your regions have done a lot of work, but more needs to be done. And we'll sort of engage in thinking about ways to do more in the next few minutes. As I mentioned earlier, there is variation in child labor. In the period that I just mentioned, between 2000 and 2012, child labor among girls fell by 40%. But that reduction was lower for boys. It only fell by 25%. Any guesses as to why that's the case? Why there is that sort of disparity or difference between girls and boys? Yes? Okay. So that the answer is that boys have more physical strength, and so if they're building houses, doing farm work, they may be retained, while girls might be left to go. Any other guesses or thoughts on why? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The families may protect the girls more than the boys, consequently having that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's important to emphasize that stereotype part. So thank you for bringing that up. So that might also be playing out. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they may not be in child labor, and they may not be counted in child labor, but they may be getting married. So again, which is not necessarily helpful for their future. To think about fulfilled individuals who are able to do more things with their lives. Yes. Preschooling had a lot of effect on this, especially preschooling targeted at increasing the number of young girls in school. But that also led to sort of a decline in the overall numbers. And then there's variation by your country, right? So some of your countries have ratified the Convention number 138 that sort of addresses child labor in terms of the age at which children can work, the kind of work they can do, as well as how many hours they can work. And in 73 of the member countries of the UN have 15 years as the sort of minimum age that children can work. So they have to be 15 or older. And then 41 member states have 16 as their age. So if you're 16, you're eligible to work with legally. And 49 member states have 14 as their sort of requisite age. I mean, how many of you think that 14 is an appropriate age for full-time work? 15? 16? So the tendency, so in some sense, if you were to influence one another as member countries, you might say that 16 should be the age that is really appropriate, because at 14 and 15, you still need to engage with schoolwork and continue engaging in developing yourself and preparing for work. But that discrepancy, that difference suggests that there is some room for work in terms of having a more coherent agreement among member states on what's the appropriate age for work. By regions, if we broke it down by regions, we see quite a variation. Asia and South Pacific have, in terms of total numbers, have the largest number of children working. 78 million, which represents 9.3% of the children in that region. Sub-Saharan Africa has fewer children working, but a larger proportion of children, so a larger percentage of children in the labor force. 59 million with 21% of the children who are working in sort of also, especially in agriculture, but also in some mining in some cases. Latin America and Caribbean have 13 million children, which is an equivalent of 8.8% of the children working. And Middle East and North Africa has 9.2 million children, which is equivalent to about 8.4% of the children. So it's pretty much, other than North America, if we look at the other regions, there's still work to be done. If we could get to zero on each 0%, that would be a wonderful thing. If you slice it by half, that would be a better deal. If you, instead of having the current numbers we have. The challenging thing is that this is a problem that raises a lot of competition. So while you, as member states, have agreed through resolutions, through the work of the International Labor Organization, that child labor is something that needs to be addressed, at the same time, those of you who are from developing countries tend to think of child labor as a meaningful way of dealing with your economy. You think that it contributes to the economy, and so economic growth becomes the preoccupation rather than thinking about child well-being and child welfare and the future of the children. The other component is that within families that are supposed to be the protectors of the children, and based on the cultural values that prevail, sometimes families think of them as a source of income to the household. So if we send Joe to work for 6 hours or 7 hours, that will bring some income into the household. So there's that sort of contradiction. On the one hand, there's a need to bring it in and address it. On the other hand, you're battling with the idea of contribute to the economy on the one hand, or contribute to the household income. And we'll get to maybe some ways that we can address some of the problems. The nature and the impact of child labor, if we think about it, the areas that are most affected are agriculture, which employs about 60% of the children. But the other sectors, service and industry, especially informal industry, are also important to think about. Children also work in mines and in domestic work. And domestic work is normally thought of as the hidden areas where children are working, but it's not obvious. You don't see it unless you go into somebody's house and investigate. You may not know that children are laboring or working. And then child labor, to really think about it, is always harmful to the child's well-being, to the child's human rights, their mental health, their emotional health. So rather than enhancing the well-being of the child and strengthening them, it has sort of a negative implication to the child. In terms of sheer numbers, we know that 6 in 10 children who are laborers work in agriculture. And most commonly, they work as unpaid workers or working in family farms. They work in cotton, they work in sugarcane, they may work in rice, and all sorts of other areas of agriculture. So agriculture might be a place where we pay attention to. just by the sheer fact that it's really impacting children. And also to really think about the fact that they are working for their families. So how do we negotiate that element where the families are the ones that love them and care for them the most, yet they are using them for this purpose? Uh, and the agriculture is not limited to the farm. They also participate in market activities. So it's not unusual in some parts of the world, in parts of Asia, to see the children pulling carts that have the food that was produced from the farm being sent to the market. And it remains one of the most challenging and important sectors, with 98 million children, or 59%, still work involved in agriculture. Services, such as working in restaurants, is also another area where children, up to 54 million children are assumed to be involved in that area. And then industry, especially the informal industry, is another employer. So children who work in making fireworks in some areas, so carpeting in Southern Asia, or children who work as shoe shines, shining shoes for adults who are going to work. I want to emphasize the importance of education in addressing this. So as we start thinking about ways forward, education is going to be the key. We know that educated parents are less likely to send their kids to work in farms or to work for themselves, or to work for them. They value the role of learning in preparing you for the future. So if we focus on education for the children, we will have parents who actually emphasize the importance of education for their own children in the future. Likewise, education gets children out of the labor force. And we'll talk shortly about some programs that have been done in that regard. But a key contribution in this case is having free and compulsory education. So if we have free and compulsory education, you have a conduit through which to get your populations, your communities, even in very rural areas, to focus on, rather than doing farm work, focus on making sure that children get the right education for the future. You've taken past international action. We have Declaration on the Rights of the Child from 1959, and then the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. Most of you, with the exception of a few countries, are signatories to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that's enough groundwork. It suggests to me that as delegates, as member countries of the UN, you are invested in the rights of children. You want to do something about it, and perhaps we can move forward in that regard. These resolutions define children's rights, including their age, sort of limiting who is a child and at what age they can work, the kind of work they can do, and how many hours they need to work. So you've already kind of created a basic framework for moving our global community forward in that regard. The biggest challenges that remain, and this is some of the issues that you have to tackle going forward, is the idea of the respect for your national sovereignty. That those of you who have not enforcing rules and regulations or laws around child labor may be reluctant to be told how to proceed. And this is an important thing. If you agree on a way forward, then you may erode that fear of being inspected or being subjected to accountability. And then the second one is the limited state adherence to international guidelines. So the guidelines around rights, guidelines around how much time you need to spend working, guidelines around age. Most of your nations do not adhere to these regulations. How do we prevent and eliminate child labor? Any ideas on how we might prevent and eliminate child labor? Yes. Yeah, so the children, you're suggesting that children should stand up and say, down with child labor. Okay? not continue working. Yeah, so that might be a way that if children say, no, we're not working anymore, we are downing our tools. Those of you who may have watched, those of you from America, which I'm assuming you're all delegates from other places, but you may have watched the newsies if you're as a young person, and you see children kind of saying, no, we're not dealing with that anymore. So that's a possibility. Yes. One of you can go. Uh-huh. Mhm. Absolutely. So you're talking the poverty issue. That if the household is poor and you rely on agriculture as your main source of income and source for food, it's very likely that you'll keep your kid working in the farm than thinking about, well, maybe we invest in their future. So the poverty might be a trap for some families. And so we might have to deal with poverty and think about ways of improving economies in developing countries, especially. Yes, you had your hand up. Uh huh. Hmm. Hmm. Olivia, absolutely. Having free education, providing free lunches or free breakfast in school would be enough to entice families. And as we'll see, there are also things that can be done at the UN level that would improve the situation. Uh, so lack of education, as I mentioned, is one of the challenges. And so we would have to tackle education and sort of address awareness. And then cultural values around it's important for children to work or to know how to work as opposed to gain sort of formal education, which might help them in the long run. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So working with the private sector, because it's important for national governments to have laws and regulations, but the private sector, the people who are employing these children and requiring higher wages for adults might be a great way. And also holding the ones that you find who are using child labor accountable, because that's the other area that we may have to deal with. Some solutions that we know have worked is providing access to education for children in rural and underdeveloped areas to prevent child labor. So if you provide education and if you add in a school lunch or a school breakfast so that children don't have to worry about sustenance, in some sense it might entice parents to send their kids to school if they're poor parents because they know their kids will be fed there. So they don't have to worry about, well, if the kid goes to the farm, they'll bring food because they're going to be fed anyway. The UN supported a program that was implemented in India that provided a combination of scholarships for children who couldn't pay the school, but also stipends for families that may have felt reluctant to send send their kids to school from work because they're going to lose their income. So the income issue is addressed because they're getting a stipend. And if there's cost to education, they actually provide a scholarship. So combining that sort of approach is an innovative way of dealing with it. And then the larger issue is really public awareness. Because a lot of the public, sometimes the general public, if the general public is not aware, enforcement becomes a challenge. Demanding new policies or new laws becomes a challenge. Or even the fact that there might be international rights, if we are not aware in our separate countries that we come from, people may not actually be willing or able to act on this issue. All right, so it's your time. How do we move forward? If these are some proposals that I have just really seen, but what other things are of concern? What other ways can we deal with the issues of poverty, lack of education, human rights violations that associate with cultural values that I mentioned before? You have your hand up? Yes. absolutely. So if the family feels secure if you provide government policies that address minimum wage or address the kind of wage that people have and provide some sort of social safety net for families that may not have enough, that they will not be impeded by their poverty. They will still send their kids to school. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's a real economic conundrum. So if there is a fear that in the private sector by raising wages means that whatever you're producing you have to sell them for more. So then how do we address that? In any way we can address that, this particular issue? If I raise wages and my fear is that then if I'm selling you something, I have to sell it for higher rates, which might actually make it impossible for some people to buy them. Uh-huh. So dealing with all the different players or all the different factors. So rather than just focusing on the wage, addressing the source, addressing the consumer in the end, perhaps the taxation associated with it, so that you can actually get to a number that doesn't necessarily negatively affect the prices in the end. Yes. Uh-huh. Hmm. Okay. So figure out within the specific companies or producers how they can retain their prices by incentivizing the workers, by negotiating with perhaps with the government and taxes, for instance, to reduce the taxation. Yes. Okay. So making sure that there are regulations that govern, that the governments, your governments, are involved in making sure that children who are working are safe and the working conditions are safe if they are of particularly appropriate ages too. So we have to make sure that their age is appropriate, so they're not underage, and that the working conditions meet the minimum requirements that are identified by the International Labour Organization. Yes. Okay. So that having an idea for the future is the suggestion. So yes, there is child labor. It's still persistent, but we can do something as we approach the future. Yes. Okay. 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 So holding companies or employers accountable. And I might actually throw in, if I'm saying that part of the problem is agriculture and that the children sometimes are not even being paid because they're working for their families. So how do you address that one? If you're working, so it's not, if it's a company, you'll say you'll find the company. So do you find the parents? Do you imprison the parents? Hey, you sent your child to child labor, so we will imprison you. So your child will be without a parent. Or do we have other alternatives for that particular issue in agriculture? Yes. So if you meet basic needs of children, their families will not need to use them as a conduit to actually support the families. And so it might be that the governments have to focus either in partnerships with private entities, because sometimes governments clearly don't have, the money doesn't have, it's not an endless stream. So perhaps a partnership with the private companies, foundations, to think about ways to improve the well-being of families so they do not have to use their children as a way to raise money and resources. Yes? So the proposal here is that the focus should really be on empowering the children themselves. That if the children are educated and aware of their rights and the negative implications on working in terms of child labor, then they are likely to stand up for their rights and claim those rights, both with their families and with broader society. Other questions? Yes. So you're talking about cases of child trafficking. If it's systematically conducted where they're being trafficked for labor, it's a lot more complicated to stand up when you're already taken from your family. But if it's with your family, it's much you might be able to do something. The challenging cases also is sometimes the cultural values. That if culturally children are assumed to be, they're supposed to be quiet and not be heard, they're supposed to be just around and not say anything, that might also impede the idea of speaking up. But with education and empowerment, people and young people especially can say, we're down with child labor, stop child labor. Yes. Okay. So maintaining the, even the kids who are working, making sure that they have an education as a way of getting them, keeping them connected with the world of learning and the world of sort of just growing up. Any particular different questions? Any questions that anyone might have? Yes. Yeah. So the suggestion is that is the case in some countries, such as the United States of America, where you have you're required to be in school up to a particular age. So compulsory education as a way of making sure that kids stay in school. That because they are required to be in school, so they can't be active in labor. So that might be a solution that is offered here. Yes. So the suggestion up here is that people who use child labor should be not only punished, but they should be named and shamed by being. That the information should be allowed. The rest of the population should know what companies or factories are using child labor, and thereby they will be pariah. In some sense, if you took that to the next level, you could also argue that once they are found to be using child labor, that we could actually boycott their products, on top of sanctioning them. So we could do that as an additional solution. Okay. So thinking about creative ways of combining, and again, I think that will also require us to figure out at what age are we allowing that to happen. So if we say the floor is at age 16, and then at 16, even as they work, they can still participate in schooling, so they're not losing out on the education component. So in countries where you have age 14, while we encourage that age to be raised, we could still figure out sort of creative ways of devising additional schooling for those children, so they're not missing out on the fundamentals of education. Yes. Hmm. Absolutely. So that there needs to be sort of a distinction between harmful child labor and child labor. And so some forms of child labor that has negative health consequences on children, or that may be harmful to to them emotionally, or places where they are abused, that those need to be controlled, while thinking about creative ways of the children, if they could learn skills through work, and be socialized that way. But again, it goes back to making sure that we are clear about what age should children start work. So that yes, they may be 17, they're still considered children, and if they're working, they may be able to survive pretty well. On the other hand, if they are 10 and they're working in farms and not going to school, it's sort of having a negative consequence for their future. Yes. Yeah, so having a clear parameters around how many hours children can work, which you have already agreed on globally. There's already some sort of agreement on how many hours children should work and how long they should work. So really kind of implementing and enforcing that in your individual countries. Yes. So making sure that the business actually provides for an opportunity for them to learn. So whoever the employer, if they are in a factory, making sure that there's space for learning. Yeah. So figuring out creative ways of making sure that the labor isn't harmful, but can actually help them in the future. And but again, you're emphasizing the important thing is that the age still has to be there has to be an agreed upon age in which they start working. Yes. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. The question is, why is it that they can't do both? Go to school, and then if they need to work, work later. I think that's the fundamental problem is that the tendency is to use child labor and forget about the child's well-being. So because the labor is cheaper, they can do the same work that an adult can do for less money if they're in a factory, or they can do that work for free if they're doing it for the family. And so the emphasis becomes on survival or making profits for the employer as opposed to the child's well-being. So if the child's well-being was the focus, their human rights, their right to education, then we would make sure that they have enough work time to do schoolwork, and then afterwards work for a limited number of hours that they can actually go home and do their homework if they have homework, and have sort of a decent childhood. Yes, indeed. for developing countries, that might not be a very interesting option for them because if the economy is already, they're already trying to grow the economy, which is the contradictions I mentioned, because they're thinking, well, this child labor thing, it might be problematic, yes, but it helps our economy. Um, my argument would be that perhaps by abolishing child labor altogether and paying adults well, that's a better economic model. Because otherwise, you're just cheating the children and cheating their families and keeping some adults out of work because the children are taking those jobs for cheaper rates. And so rather than contracting the economy, if you grew the economy through education, through skills that are global, that actually the outcomes might be better. But I see how the economy, it's still related to the economy, so it makes sense to me. Yes. So ask the children, do you need the money? The challenging thing, yeah, the challenging thing is that in some cases, the children even start working because their parents owed the person money, the employer. So they are not even earning the money. The earnings were already spent. So they're working, it's almost servitude because they're working for money that was already spent, that was not loaned to them individually, was loaned to their family either because somebody was sick and they needed extra money to go procure health services. And so that complicates it. And in some cases, when they're working for their families, they are unable to keep any of the money. It's like, well, you live here, you eat here. So why are you asking for it? So it complicates it. But fundamentally, you are right. It's their children's rights. And having children, including children in other countries, bringing that issue to the attention of the public would be a helpful way to move forward. Making children be the voice of their rights, as opposed to just be quiet and have adults speak for them. Yes, over here. Okay. So look at multiple systems. Improve the education system, make it more accessible, educate the children themselves and educate their families. They become educated parents who don't use their children. So that might be also an important thing, that really looking at it as a complex phenomenon that has multiple parts. It's not just the idea of labor, that they come from families, and there is an economic part, and there's a legal or policy element as well. Yes. I think that's a really wonderful place to end. That the fundamental thing to think about is the well-being of the children. Yes, there are types of work that might actually be rewarding to the children and are not harmful to their well-being. But so as you think about resolutions, as you think about the way forward to really emphasize children's rights, children's well-being, making sure that the skills that they need to acquire for the future are facilitated. And I believe that together, as member countries of the United Nations, you can do this. As young people who are interested in your own welfare and the welfare of others, you can sort of set the stage on which we change the situation and we can develop more and more solutions. I want to thank you very much for all the ideas and go do it. Change the world.